Hello, everyone. I'm Kadeen Chambers, and welcome to Beneath the Surface. All you need to get the most out of this show is an open and inquisitive mind. Today's show, we will be looking at suicide prevention awareness. Many persons are directly or indirectly impacted by suicide. Worldwide, one person commits suicide every 40 seconds, according to the World Health Organization. Right now, we also should remember that during periods of extreme stress, think something like a global pandemic, economic or social crises, personal trials, persons with mental health conditions or suicidal thoughts are even more at risk. Did you know that in the last 45 years, death by suicide has increased globally by over 60%? Did you know that suicide is among the leading causes of death for persons aged 15 to 44? Did you know that suicide attempts are up to 20 times more frequent than completed suicide? This is a very important topic. Our guest today is Dr. Robin Schupper. She is a licensed psychologist. She has been a clinician and lecturer for over 30 years and is one of the most empathetic persons that I have ever met. Disclaimer here, she was my lecturer when I was completing my master's degree. Dr. Schupper is passionate about mental health, and the topic of suicide is an important one to her. When we decided to do our part in increasing awareness about suicide prevention, Dr. Schupper was naturally the person to call on. Dr. Schupper, thank you so much for joining us on BTS.
Thank you so much for having me, Kadeen, and please call me Robin. So disclaimer here, I have to say that you were one of the most impressive students we'd ever had.
Thank you. So, Robin, suicide prevention awareness. Some of the information that I shared a moment ago are staggering and alarming. And I am grateful that I have the opportunity to work with you to really share some information with our viewers.
Very concerning, even what's been happening this year, just the beginning statistics that we're seeing.
Yeah. So annually, about how many persons die by suicide in the US?
It's really hard to say at the current time. The problem is that the statistics we get in the United States are usually a couple of years behind. So the most recent statistics that are put out by the National Institutes of Mental Health and the CDC are from basically 2018. They are, working on compiling more recent ones, but that is, of course, of concern. But, they were basically, you're looking at it being the second leading cause of death among those between 10 and 34 years of age. And it's the fourth leading cause of death among those who are between the ages of 35 and 54. Now, those may have changed slightly in the last couple of years, but as of 2018, that's what we were looking at. And there were also more than twice as many suicides as there were homicides in the US in 2018. So when you think about that and how much we hear about homicides, that's really concerning.
Yes, very, very much so. And I will add that some of the statistics that I saw while researching and preparing is that globally, I think it's from the data is from 2018 as well. The World Health Organization has said that over 800,000 persons have died globally from suicide at that point.
About 1 person every 30 seconds, the World Health Organization. It's just staggering to think the worldwide problem, how many people we're losing each year by suicide.
Yes, and I just a couple of weeks ago, I am Jamaican, though I now live in the US, and there was a story from Jamaica a couple of weeks ago that highlighted that a little girl, 8 years old, was found hanging. And, people were alarmed, shocked that a child so young would take their own lives. And so this underscores even more the importance of discussing, everything relating to suicide. And so one of the questions that I think is most important for people in general to understand is what typically drives somebody to take their own life or to attempt to.
This is a great question. One thing is when we have an increased level of stress, as you mentioned, especially financial issues. So when we're talking about adults, financial issues can spur a number of at least considerations of suicide. And we're actually, most recently, I saw estimates that in June of this year, 11% of US adults who were interviewed said that they had had serious thoughts of suicide. So when you look at a really stressful circumstance like what we're experiencing worldwide with fears of our health, fears of losing our positions, and for many, we basically identify with our jobs and our careers. Losing that can actually impact us. The thoughts that we can't take care of our families. So those are some things that can definitely impact. It's really interesting though. I found this fascinating study from Australia. It was published in 2019. They actually did in-depth interviews with approximately 45 people, but they also had some surveys of over 11,500 Australians, all of whom, well, the 45 or so had attempted suicide. So those were the ones that they had done in-depth interviews. But they interviewed 11,500 Australians who reported that they had considered suicide during their lifetime. And it was interesting to hear what they actually said, because we can just kind of hypothesize as to why people do it, but these people actually told us why they did. A lot of times they said that they felt they were a burden to other people. They felt like, maybe either they couldn't take care of themselves or they no longer served the purpose of, say, a caregiver or the person who was earning the money and supporting. A lot of times they said that they were concerned about other people judging them and feeling that they were significantly harmed or different, or they really thought negatively about themselves. They were experiencing extreme psychological distress at the time. And the number one things that they said that they were specifically experiencing, they felt they couldn't cope with whatever the situation was. They felt that they were helpless to resolve whatever the situation was, and they felt hopeless. They felt like it was never going to get better. And then the last was they sensed that they were disconnected from society or from those around them. Interestingly enough, they would acknowledge that they had done that themselves, that they had, over a period of time, isolated or disconnected themselves from those around them. So it was basically those factors.
The takeaway from that I want us all to really focus on is the fact that there are so many different reasons that were given for attempting suicide. And but the key thing was that there is a sense of hopelessness that each person had felt like there's no way to fix what was happening to them or to deal with an issue that they had.
Absolutely. And I think that the research has borne that out throughout the decades when they've done this, is that helplessness and hopelessness are the two most significant factors. If you see that you have issues, but you can see a way out, or you can see that it might change at some point, or that there are options, you can get through anything. But when you absolutely think you can't cope with it and there's nothing else that can be done, that is, going to be a significant trigger. It's also really interesting that there are certain populations who are more likely to seriously consider suicide, and also to actually go ahead with the process. Many more suicides are attempted than are actually completed, and there are many more suicide attempts by females, but males tend to be more likely to get through that and actually kill themselves than females. And in part it's because they choose more lethal means, say like firearms, or hanging, which is unusual for a female. The age is unusual in the case you mentioned in Jamaica, as is the gender, because females tend to not use such lethal means.
I know that there are lasting impacts on families and friends of left behind by somebody who has committed suicide, who has died by suicide. What has the research borne out that as it relates to the impact on those who are left behind when a loved one dies by suicide?
It's really interesting. I think that there is no one impact, just like with grief. Basically, it's very personal. I do think that there are some themes that tend to be borne out more significantly across people. It's interesting, many people have two specific emotions. It's not true of everybody, but many do. Guilt and anger. Guilt because they feel like there's something they should have done, they should have seen, they should have been aware of. And in reality, many times, it's very hard. If someone really seriously is intending on ending their life and they don't want anybody to know, then it's very hard to determine that, although there can be signs. And there are things we can do to become more aware of them. But the other is anger, and that seems interesting. We a lot of times we don't want to actually acknowledge that because it seems like a horrible thing about ourselves that we're angry at the person. But even when somebody dies and they die from a significant illness like cancer or something, we still have that anger that they left us. And then suicide seems even more significant because they chose to leave us, is what we're thinking. So that can have such significant impacts on those left behind, because here they're dealing with guilt and anger for someone that they've lost, and that just really eats into them. And they don't really want to talk about that then, because first of all, they may talk about the guilt, but they may not talk about the anger because that makes them feel badly. And that just can really eat you up inside because you haven't actually addressed it.
Okay. You mentioned signs that that sometimes loved ones left behind feel guilty that they hadn't seen signs, and so that leads us right into a very important question. What are some of the signs that family and friends, that loved ones can use to identify someone who is at risk of attempting suicide?
Well, it's really interesting. One thing that a lot of people will say is that they felt that the person was drifting away from them to some degree. They may be present physically, but they feel like, that they're not as accessible. They don't really think they know what's going on with them emotionally. They get the sense that even though the person is telling them that they're fine, it's just that sense that they're not really, being genuine. So what I would suggest, with people is that we tend to just take people at face value, and it may be a good idea, but because you don't want to be suspicious of everybody. But when you see someone's behavior is kind of changing, or when you sense something, like you get the sense that something's just not right, in our gut, we may be wrong, but the reality is that we tend to know those pretty close to us fairly well. And even if we're not really identifying what it is that's different, we know there's something different. And we also have to be aware that people tend to push us away a lot. So, and sometimes we may allow that to happen just because, we're giving them their space. But when we find that somebody seems kind of troubled, seems like there's something going on, and then they keep putting us off, they don't want to get together, or they, don't really want to talk very long, they keep cutting us off the phone, or they won't contact us, I think that's a sign that we really need to reach out. We may just step back, but that's the last thing we should probably do. We really need to kind of push ourselves forward towards them, because it's so easy when you're depressed to step back from people and not want contact, and to try and just push people away. So I think that that's a big thing. I also think when people start talking about feeling overwhelmed and feeling stressed, and when we respond to them, they just don't see that there's any options or any way out, and any suggestions we make, they kind of like push aside and find reasons why they won't work. I think that should be a concern. I think if you notice that someone has a serious physical illness, they've lost a job, something is wrong in a relationship or they've lost somebody. These are all things that can spur us to consider suicide if it seems like things are just not going to get better. And one of the major things is we're afraid to ask the question. And we're just afraid that if we bring up the word suicide, it's going to suggest it to somebody. And the reality is that we have to have that discussion. We have to know if somebody is thinking of harming themselves or ending their life, and when things are overwhelming.
True. So we all need to be more comfortable, willing, and ready to actually offer support if we see that our loved ones or friends seem to be having a hard time dealing with a challenging situation or circumstance. And sometimes we may not be aware of a problem that is happening or a situation, but just as you identified, a significant change in behavior, and those red flags start going off, and we should really check in and to offer support, because that can really offer real help in that moment.
Absolutely. And there are a couple of specific things that we should look for in terms of change of behavior. If they suddenly just all of a sudden become calm and they've been stressed, that's unusual. We need to look into that. If they're abusing alcohol or substances of other kinds, and more so, or they just started, that's a concern. And also the number one risk factor, which I think you mentioned before, is that if they have a prior suicide attempt. It's interesting, one of the studies I looked at, only 10% of them said that after the suicide attempt, they felt badly about it and relieved that they hadn't succeeded. The others still really had the sense that they'd be better off dead. And so I think we need to look at the fact that if someone has made a prior suicide attempt, even if they seem like they're doing better, it's still something that really needs to be watched closely, because they can suddenly slip back into that. And, it seems to be a viable thought then in their mind.
And this is an important gem that I'm going to pull out. This is something that we discussed when I was in your class as well. One of the most important factors that highlight a possible suicide attempt is a previous attempt. Did I say that right?
Yes.
And that's something that we must all pay very close attention to. Once we know somebody who has attempted suicide, we need to give them keen attention as we help them to work through, or offer support as we get them to work through whatever situation has them feeling overwhelmed and hopeless.
And it's really ironic that sometimes when they seem like they're doing so well afterwards, they've been in therapy, people report that they're doing better, they report they're doing better. That may actually be the time when they make their next attempt. Robin Williams, actually, people around him said that he seemed much better, his mood was good, everybody was surprised at the time that he chose to do it. But that's not unusual. So it might be when someone's in an upward kind of trajectory, that they might actually make their attempt. They have the energy to do it, and they may feel clear-headed even if they're not, and they may actually try to kill themselves even though it seems like they're doing so much better.
You mentioned that there are some groups that might be more at risk for suicide. Share with us what groups are those?
Well, it's interesting. Minorities actually have a higher rate of suicide attempts, and so just in 2020, according to the CDC, those who were Hispanic had a higher than average suicide attempt rate, and Black adults had a higher than average suicide intent or thought rate. People who are essential care workers actually this year have a double the rate of thinking about their suicide, which is really concerning. because those in the healthcare system, they're experiencing not only just stress about having to work so many hours, but they're also oftentimes separated from their families because they can't take the risk of possibly giving them the COVID-19 virus. And in addition, they're seeing so much death. I heard one woman on television who was a nurse talking about how at times she had to decide who was going to live and who was going to die based on what kinds of care they could give. So if you think about it, it's this putting them in a sense where, in a situation where they feel helpless and hopeless. They can't do anything to fix it, and the situation doesn't seem like it's getting any better. So I think those are particular groups. Interestingly enough, it was that adult males who were in their 60s and higher were the highest rate, but right now it looks like middle-aged white males are becoming the highest risk for suicide intent. And in part, maybe that's because they may have lost jobs, have significant financial issues right now, and they see themselves as, the ones who are responsible for taking care of their families. So I think we need to take a real look at that. But children as young as 10, I hadn't heard 8-year-olds, but it's very feasible, are, considering it more. I think they feel incredibly stressed. We tend to just go after them for the fact that they're not wearing masks, or they seem like all they care about is being with their friends. But the reality is that's what their lives are supposed to be about at this point. And by having the world change so drastically, think about who feels more helpless than a child. They have no power, they have no ability to make changes, and they don't understand what's going on. So we also have to consider them as well.
I'm happy you've highlighted that, because the reality is, if we as adults are having such a difficult time adjusting to all the changes that have been taking place around us, we need to remember that these changes are also impacting the children in our lives as well, and to really, we really should give them some attention, speak to them about what is happening, how they are feeling, how are they coping with online schooling, or for some who don't have access to the internet and don't necessarily now have the opportunity with ease to attend school online, they're feeling left out. So in addition to not being able to spend time with friends and all of that, there's so much going on in their world as well that we really do, as parents and caregivers, need to take the time out to check in with them and to make sure that they are, that they're okay as they can be in this situation as well.
I think that's a great point. And I think also to focus on, giving them an idea of how to cope with these things. I think we don't realize that basically everything children learn, they learn from others, either observation or from, direct teaching. And if we're not helping them to figure out how to see, how you can cope with these issues, that there are other options, that, there are ways that we can get support, we can get help. Talking about it can be very good, but if they're not, if they're not observing this in the adults around them, if people are trying to keep all this from them and thinking that that's going to help them, if they're not actually working with children to learn coping skills, then they're really not going to learn them, and that's going to escalate their issues.
That is so true, and I'm going to use this moment now to share a little bit, to disclose. So my daughter is 18, as you know, and so she's had a whole lot of changes for her as well as it relates to school and so on. And we've noticed that she hasn't been sleeping. Well, her sleeping patterns would have been different anyway, because, teenagers. But we noticed that she was sleeping even less, and we were talking to her about it. And she just kept saying, "Oh, I can't sleep. You know me, I can't sleep. I'm trying, but I can't." And it was just last week that we literally had a forceful kind of sit down where we went, okay, but sleep is important. So if it is that you can't sleep, it must be for a reason. Let's talk about it. And what came out of that conversation as a family chat was that she really was feeling a little bit overwhelmed and not sure about so many things. And she's 18. So what we did was, okay, do you want us to get you a therapist to talk to? No, I'm not ready for that yet. I went, okay, what I want you to do is to write down all the things that is running through your mind at nights when you lay down, because I'm thinking that's what's happening. And she admitted that, yes, that's what it is. I said, okay, write them down. After you do that, then you look at each thing and you highlight Is this factual? Is this real? Is this something that is possibly going to happen, or how severe, to see if it really is worth the worry that you're worrying about it. And a couple of days later, we followed up with her. Did you write them down? We had to, encourage her. She got to the place where she said, "Okay, I've now written them down, and I'm sleeping better." And so I'm sharing because I want to highlight to our viewers the importance of literally sitting down and talking to our kids and being patient with them and understanding. So that helped her. She's now sleeping better, and I'm hoping that I'm encouraging each parent, each caregiver. Once you are responsible for a child, check in with them. How are they coping? What is going on with them? How are they perceiving what is happening with all the changes that we're all experiencing regarding the pandemic? Let's not wait until things get terribly wrong, before we then try to do something about it. So I'm happy that we were able to bring this out. Now,
that's wonderful. I have to say that, first of all, the fact that you're disclosing it, I think, is excellent. I can't tell you how many times this year I've talked with people who I was concerned that, they were feeling overwhelmed, they were feeling helpless. I can't disclose because they're not related to me. But I think the more that we're able to share that it's normal, that it happens in every family. I did have an uncle who actually was a suicide. I was much younger at the time and I really didn't understand it, but it happens in every family where at least, and it happens with all of us at some point. Most of us have at least some point thought, well, the world would be better off if I wasn't here. Now it may just be a fleeting thought, but it's rare that we haven't had these kinds of thoughts. And I think we're just afraid to talk about that. We think it means something about us, but we're human. And so, at some point, this is maybe going to be a fleeting thought. Maybe it's going to be a lasting thought, but we need to follow up. And even if things seem like they're, going well now, that doesn't mean that at some later point, we don't need to follow up and ask.
So moving from that now, I want us to look at two things. How do we offer help? How do we offer help to acquaintances? So these may be persons who you're not necessarily extremely close to. So whether it is somebody who you work with, go to church with, go to school with, so you spend some amount of time in the person's company, and you're noticing some of the signs that we either mentioned or something that makes you concerned. How do you help such a person versus how do you now offer help to close family or friends? So let's talk about acquaintances first. What would you suggest that we do if we are concerned about an acquaintance?
Well, that's a really good question. It's so hard because we're so uncomfortable even, talking to those we're close to. So it's incredibly hard to talk to an acquaintance. I remember I was sitting in a fast food restaurant once and I saw this teenager. I think he must have been about 18, 19 years old. And he just was crying. And I just walked over and I asked what was going on. And so he told me, and I ended up helping him to call to get some assistance. I think the number one thing is that we really have to care about other people. I mean, I think we have to be empathic. We have to see when we think that someone is in distress. I think we need to consider whether or not we want to take that step and reach out to them. And so the number one thing that a lot of people said, because when I looked through the literature about this, a lot of people just said all they wanted was for someone to listen to them and not judge them. And so I think the major thing is that if you ask somebody how they're doing, to really care about the answer. How many times does someone say, "I'm fine," and you have no idea how they really are? You know that that's just a saying. They're just saying they're fine, they're okay. But it takes, you then following up with the next step and saying, well, what does that really mean? Because, a lot of times someone says, "I'm fine," and you can tell there's no feeling behind that. So if you truly care, then the number one thing you can do is really ask and say, "Are you sure? Because that really doesn't sound like it. And, I'm happy to listen." I think that's what's really important, listening without judging.
That is profound, and it's easy for all of us to do. And I'm going to share that I remember many years ago, I a co-worker of mine, and this wasn't somebody who I was close to. She had recently enough joined the company. And I remember I was going through the door one evening. Her desk was closer to the door. And I'm passing and I said, you okay? There was just something about her. I said, you okay? And usually, as you say, we say that and we just keep walking. In many instances, we don't even wait to hear yes or no, or we say, how are you? And we don't wait for a response. It's like we automatically expect the person to say, I'm good, I'm fine, I'm okay. So it was just, it's like saying good morning, and you keep walking. So I said, are you okay? And the look on her face made me stop. And she seemed surprised that I stopped because she looked really stressed. And we had a conversation about that with her explaining a problem that she had. And what I did was then took the time to try and help her figure out, okay, I'm going to do this in the morning to assist you with X, Y, and Z. And I know it made a major difference to her. And so as you pointed out, we need to care. It's about taking the time. It's about when you see that somebody looks like things aren't so okay with them, like they're off, to pause and really ask the question and pause to hear the response. Care about what that response is going to be, and so that's a great way to deal with persons, whether you know them well or not. So that's one way of dealing with acquaintances and people who we don't know well. Now,
it's also really important, though, for people that we do know. I think we still do the same thing. Sometimes either afraid to go further into it, or we just don't for whatever reason. But the other thing that we tend to do with, and this is, I think, even more so with people we do know well, we're close to, we try to just dismiss their feelings. We try to say, well, that's not really a problem. There's many ways you can deal with it. That's, you're overreacting. And I think that those are all things that help to push someone away. When we're just either trying to fix it for them, or we're trying to say that it's not an issue, they look at that as judgment, and they look at that as being dismissed or rejected. And the biggest issue, especially for someone you truly care about, is for them to take that step back away from you. Then you're just kind of chasing them. And that's harder and harder to do when you have someone who is truly intent on killing themselves. But if you actually just are a soft place to land and you're willing to listen, and as you said before, which is incredibly important, be patient, because a lot of times they're not going to make those steps as quickly as we would want, or to change their thinking, after we've had one conversation with them, or even two. They're not going to reach out maybe for help. We may need to do that for them. They may say that, they'll think about services, or, they'll consider something, but maybe we need to be the legs for them and the voice for them, be their advocate, because they can't be at that moment. They don't have the wherewithal to do so. So I think we really need to recognize what our role is.
Well said. So it's good to highlight that we also need to do this, or can and should do this, for persons who we're close to. Are there any other things that we need to, or that we can rely on, use to offer support to persons who we are close to, if we get a feeling that they may be at risk of suicide?
I think educating ourselves is really important. I think we need to be aware of what the services are. Like, if we don't know what numbers to call in case of this, some crisis situation, if we don't know who to call, if, we would need some kind of mental health assistance, if we have wrong and incorrect and inaccurate views about mental health issues, if we're feeling that there's this huge stigma and so we're ashamed or uncomfortable, those are all things that are going to make it that much harder on those we care about, as well as on ourselves. I definitely think the National Alliance for Mental Illness, I don't know if they're in other countries, but they're a huge resource here. It's NAMI, N-A-M-I. They have online information, online support groups, in-person support groups, but they provide so much education on the mental health issues themselves, including depression and suicide. They also offer a lot of assistance for family members because it is so important for them to get support. I mean, if you have a family member who has attempted suicide and they haven't actually killed themselves, but they have attempted it, you still have the feelings of guilt and anger. You still feel like you're partially responsible. And now you feel this overwhelming stress about how do you protect this person and keep them safe. So you need a tremendous support as well, and need to be aware of what is out there in the community. You know, one of the things I think is both a blessing and a curse. I was really surprised, but they actually said that calls to crisis lines have gone up just since February of this year, over 800%. And then there's a crisis text line, and text to them had gone up 40%. Just since the pandemic, took like 100,000 conversations a month. So obviously there's a lot of people out there who are feeling stressed. And I'm glad to hear that they know where to reach out, but that also tells me that we need to make sure that many more people are aware of that, because that can just be the tip of the iceberg. We need to make sure people, including ourselves, know where to go, and the fact that it's okay to reach out. That actually shows strength, not weakness.
True. So we're wrapping up now. We're at the end, and I think one of the most important things, I'm going to share some information, contact information for support next. But one of the most important things that I want us to leave the show today with is, what do we do as individuals if we are having suicidal thoughts? If we are feeling hopeless, overwhelmed, and feeling like, I don't know if I can continue.
I think the number one thing is to realize that you're not alone. This is something that many people struggle with. And, you know, just like I said, when you hear the numbers, it's kind of over 800%. You know, how many people have thought of it throughout their lifetimes. You are definitely not alone. And there are people out there who care. It doesn't matter that you are alive and that you are a member of this society, this world. Reaching out is so incredibly important, and you may not realize how many options you have out there. I think that's the number one thing, is we're limited by how many options we know about. So if we think that there are no options and it's hopeless, then we're more likely to take our lives. But there's tons of opportunities out there. There's text lines, there's lines to call, there are places to go to that they're open 24 hours, 7 days a week, and there is somebody out there who wants to help.
That's the most important thing. You're not alone. If you are feeling like you want to give up, we're asking you to just keep holding on. We need you here. You are not alone. You have support. There are people who care. Just reach out. It's okay to ask for help. We want you to ask for help. And with that, I will share some numbers. In the US, Robin mentioned NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and you can reach them via phone at 1-800-273-TALK. So that's 1-800-273-8255. If you are in Jamaica, you will call 888-NEW-LIFE. That's 888-639-5433. If you are in Canada, you will call 1-833-456-4566. And if you are in the UK, 440-8457-909090. There are so many organizations, so many support groups for you to reach out to. We're asking you, hold on, keep holding on. That is it for this week's special edition of Beneath the Surface. We want to thank Robin Schupper for joining us and sharing this very vital information with us on preventing suicide. Robin, thank you so much.
Thank you for including me. This is such an important topic, and I really appreciate everything you're doing to share this with others.
super grateful for the opportunity as well. Thank you. See you next week.
Thank you for watching Beneath the Surface. Remember to subscribe, like, and share with your friends and family.